Welcome to the Free the Economy podcast. I'm your host, Richard Morrison. I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and this is episode 150 for November 20th, 2025. Free the Economy is about how we can all become happier, healthier, and wealthier in a world with less government control. A reminder, you can always find our show notes with links to the stories we cover on the Competitive Enterprise Institute blog at cei.org/blog. If you like the show, please leave us a review and follow us on Twitter at @free_the_economy. Normally, this is the part of the show where I start by covering some recent headlines and events that you should know about, and then go on to my interview with that week's guest. But this week is special because we're celebrating our Sesquicentennial, that is, our 150th episode anniversary. This week I'm going to review some of the smart, funny, passionate, and insightful guests we've had over the past 3 years, and let you hear from several of them in their own words. To streamline things, we'll group our distinguished guests by their area of expertise. We couldn't include everyone in this roundup, of course, and everyone should know that the names that we did not mention are just as high quality as the ones we did. It just means you'll have to go back and listen to all of our previous 149 episodes, if you haven't already. First up, we often talk about the world of finance and investing, including how that world is regulated by government agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission, among others. I was excited to get Russ Green of Stand Together on the show early for episode 5, to talk about corporate purpose and trends in allegedly responsible investing. We were excited to feature Nick Anthony, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives and a fellow at the Human Rights Foundation. We talked about the threats that would be created by a central bank digital currency in episode 53 and how to confront politicized debanking in episode 111. If you're interested in digital currencies and central banks, by the way, make sure to read Nick's excellent book, Digital Currency or Digital Control: Decoding CBDC and the Future of Money. Speaking of digital assets, we talked with Eric Peterson, Policy Director of the Satoshi Action Fund, in episode 86. We covered Bitcoin, banking, civil liberties, due process, and the future of cryptocurrency. We welcome Nick Morgan, President of the Investor Choice Advocates Network, who gave us a crash course on how to sue the SEC in episode 92. In episode 103, we talked with Mark Calabria, former director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency and author of the 2023 book, Shelter from the Storm: How a COVID Mortgage Meltdown Was Averted. Mark discussed hot housing topics such as interest rates, affordability, the Fannie Mae conservatorship, and the future of the mortgage market. We were especially honored to have been able to have Securities and Exchange Commission Commissioner Hester Peirce on with us twice to talk about financial regulation and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investing in particular, in episodes 41 and 104. Here's a clip of me asking her in December 2024 about the responsible investing movement's approach to voluntary versus mandatory guidelines.
Plenty of ESG proponents said a few years ago, well, yes, it was important that we have this voluntary phase of an ESG investing movement, but the time for voluntary is gone. Now we need binding regulations to push people in the right direction. Do you think ESG policy can be just advisory and hortatory and in a free market? Or were the people who are the biggest ESG proponents, was it always going to end up with mandatory regulation they wanted?
Yeah, and Richard, I'm glad you pointed out that people should be free to make their own decisions. I mean, I think that's why the system works, because you've got lots and lots of different people. Everyone has different experiences and backgrounds and preferences, and everyone's making different decisions about how to invest. People have different expectations about what's going to make a company profitable and what's not going to make a company profitable. And, go to town, you can invest however you want. Just as Richard said, don't try to tell everyone else through regulation how to invest. You're welcome to get out there on whatever social media platform you want and propound your view of investing. That's fine too. We should encourage that kind of dialogue. But I think what people talk about when they talk about just this voluntary, we're only sort of encouraging this kind of investment. It actually uses mechanisms that end up being pretty mandatory. And so you have people using, for example, proxy advisor firms, which have a lot of reach because a lot of investing, a lot of asset managers, for example, will vote the way a proxy advisor recommends that they vote, because there's so many voting decisions these asset managers have to make that it's often just easiest to follow the course that the proxy advisor sets. So if you can get your proxy advisor to recommend voting for something, you actually can end up in and the something that you're voting for might just be a precatory proposal, they call it, something that says, hey, we think the company should do a carbon emissions audit. And then, so that passes, the company doesn't have to do it, but you're putting the company on the spot essentially to do something like that. And so it effectively leads to giving leverage to people who are trying to push for certain things. And that leverage can be exercised in a back room where no one sees what they're doing to, it's a deal. Please take the shareholder proposal off and we will do XYZ to make you happy. And so you end up with a lot of pressure campaigns. Another way it can work is asset managers might sign on to net zero commitment. And that means that they're committing the funds that they're managing, which are not their funds, it's their investors' funds. They're committing them to go in a certain direction. And again, it looks all nice. It's just a voluntary compact that they're signing on to, but it ends up having the effect of taking large passive mutual funds and investing them in a way that is consistent with that net zero pledge, even though those passive mutual fund shareholders, when they were buying that mutual fund, thought that they were buying a passive fund that wouldn't invest actively or take active voting and engagement decisions. So I think there are ways in which the system as it works now ends up turning that voluntary into mandatory.
But life isn't just about dollars and cents. Sometimes it's about culture and media and creative content. We were lucky early on to score an interview with Javier Hernandez, Communications and Public Affairs Manager at YouTube. Javier talked in episode 6 about how millions of people are learning skills and building business opportunities on the platform, as well as YouTube's wider cultural impact. In episode 46, content creator Spencer Johnson talked to us about credit card points and miles and why millions of young Americans are ditching CNBC and the Wall Street Journal in order to get their personal finance advice from internet videos. In episode 67, political commentator Brad Palumbo of Brad vs. Everyone talked about the wild world of online politics, including trolls, polarization, disinformation, and whether Congress should ban TikTok. Dead Mall Explorer and documentarian Sal Amadeo of Quiet Studios joined us for episode 83, where we talked about shopping malls, third places, the retail economy, shady property developers, and the future of the American economy. Reason Magazine Associate Editor Emma Camp was with us for episode 135, where we covered Zoomers, online culture, college campuses, trad wives and girl bosses, the discourse industrial complex, and how AI is changing modern society. Be on the lookout, by the way, for Emma's new book, Good Boundaries, Essays on the Age of Risk Aversion, which will be coming soon from Ballantine Books. We also had an excellent interview with documentary filmmaker and podcast producer Destry Edwards. We talked about his new historical film, Dear Mr. President, The Letters of Julius Sand, and the struggle to rein in political corruption and the spoils system in 19th century America. You know he's good with audio and video, by the way, because he's editing this episode right now. Finally, we had Jeremiah Johnson, founder of the Center for New Liberalism, writer at Infinite Scroll on Substack, and meticulous chronicler of political and cultural discourse on social media. We talked about his viral Substack post, Ugh, Capitalism, and why some extremely online people seem to be blaming everything negative in their lives on free markets. Here, he riffs on what people mean when they refer to our current economic system as, quote, late capitalism.
I don't actually think that they are using it in a Marxist sense. I think, the origins of the phrase, it literally goes back more than 100 years, which is very amusing to me that we've been talking about late capitalism for 100 years now. And our grandchildren will be hearing about it while we're dead.
It's later than ever.
But I don't think that people use it in that sense. Like when it originated, and I'm not an expert in Marxist theory, so don't take this as gospel, but when it originated, I believe it was more of kind of a technical term. Like they were trying to distinguish early capitalism in like the very early industrial age with kind of what they saw as modern capitalism in the 1910s, 1920s. And they thought those were different kind of modes of production. And it was a more technical term. And like, that's fine. If you're doing Marxist theory and you just want to distinguish between different eras of capitalism, fine. It's all very Hegelian, right? But I think the modern usage, late capitalism, is basically just a way to say like society is collapsing because one of the trends that is kind of intertwined with capitalism and just vague complaints about capitalism is that on the political left, you basically can't admit that anything is ever going well. You can't admit that society is moving forward, that poverty has ever decreased, that racism or sexism have decreased over time. You can't admit that good things happen in the world, because it kind of would invalidate your theory that, capitalism is awful and evil and must be replaced. And we need a revolution in order to make these kind of socialist utopia happen. For that kind of leftist, acknowledging good things about the world is kind of an impossibility if you want to hold on to your theory. And so I think of late stage capitalism as basically a kind of silent empirical claim that, like, we are in a destructive and collapsing society. And sometimes you'll see this very explicitly set out. You'll see something in Vox that says, like, oh, this TV show is about the ruins of capitalism. And it's a TV show set in the current time. Like you could describe this as the ruins of capitalism, but factually, people's lives seem to be getting better all around the world.
When it comes to what we expect from the U.S. economy going forward, it depends to a great deal on what policies we see adopted in Washington, D.C., around taxes, spending, and government debt. Fortunately, we have a long list of fiscal policy wonks to walk us through these complex topics. Early on, we welcomed Dominic Pino for episode 14. At the time, he was the Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow at the National Review Institute and a regular contributor to National Review's Capital Matters section. And as of this recording, he has recently become a member of the Washington Post editorial board. In episode 14, we covered the then recent Silicon Valley Bank bailout, the state of organized labor, and the ongoing fight between populists and libertarians in the world of economic policy. He later returned for episode 114, where we talked about tariffs, labor unions, tax cuts, pensions, and why we love our nation's hardworking farmers. In episode 96, we got a bracing but necessary primer on public debt and the ever-looming fiscal cliff from Thomas Savage, research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, followed quickly by episode 98, in which Jack Salmon, then at the Philanthropy Roundtable, talked us through various tax and budget reform options, from Social Security and Medicare to low-income housing, energy subsidies, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. Speaking of which, we got a deep dive on retirement security in episode 143 from Romina Boccia. Romina is Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, editor of Debt Dispatch on Substack, and co-author of the new book, Reimagining Social Security, Global Lessons for Retirement Policy Changes. Finally, we welcomed Erica York, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation, for episode 102. Here, Erica runs down the sometimes conflicting policy goals claimed by the Trump administration for the imposition of tariffs.
There are a lot of conflicts in the way that various folks in the incoming Trump administration have spoken about tariffs and how they could potentially be deployed. But if we're talking tariffs for revenue, tariffs end up being a very inefficient way to raise revenue. First, they're a tax in and of themselves that encourages inefficient production. So they protect some domestic industries, which increases capital, workers flowing to those industries, but that's coming out of industries that are currently productive without tariffs. So you're decreasing allocative efficiency, or you're decreasing the productivity of the U.S. economy, and you're, you increase relative prices. The effect of that is to reduce people's real after-tax income after you take into account the effect of the tariff on the economy. So that means overall less output, lower wages, fewer jobs. And then the part that really sets tariffs apart as being an inefficient way to raise revenue is that they invite foreign retaliation. So you don't just have the harmful effect of the tax on the U.S. economy, you have the compounding harmful effect of foreign countries placing taxes on U.S. exports. That comes with a cost for that foreign country imposing the tariff, just like when we impose a tariff, it comes with a cost at our economy, but it also lowers U.S. export sales. So that means our export industries lose income, lose sales, lose jobs as well. So for that reason, it's not a good way to offset the cost of tax cuts. And depending on what tax cuts we get, combined with what types of tariffs we get, we could be in a situation where the economic effects of tariffs plus retaliation outweigh the economic benefits of tax cuts. So on the effect on the economy, it's very clearly a negative. On revenue potential, even the broadest tariffs that Trump campaigned on, so the 20% universal tariff plus a 60% tariff on everything from China, would fall short of offsetting just the revenue loss of TCJA permanence, not to mention all of the other tax cuts that the Trump campaigned on.
But if there's one thing I've learned from working in public policy for over 25 years, it's that people in D.C. don't have all the answers. That's why we always need to be looking to the states, our laboratories of democracy, for innovative new solutions. I had a fantastic time talking with Brooke Medina, then of the John Locke Foundation of North Carolina, for episode 16. We talked about taxes, education, occupational licensing, and economic opportunity in the Tar Heel State. For episode 31, I sat down with my old friend Carrie Conco, then Senior Vice President at the State Policy Network. We discussed communicating the ideas of liberty, changing policy at the state level, building a national political movement from the grassroots up, and the magic of federalism. Moving on to Big Sky Country, we welcomed Kendall Cotton, President and CEO of Montana's Frontier Institute, for episode 70. We covered affordable housing, red versus blue in state politics, and how his state can reclaim its crown as king of minerals and mining. I also ventured virtually down south for episode 112 to talk with Alabama Policy Institute CEO Stephanie Smith. That conversation covered spending taxpayer dollars, budget reform, cost sharing with the feds, and the state-level swamp of special interests. Finally, I had the great pleasure of talking in episode 109 with O.J. Oleka, CEO of the State Financial Officers Foundation, about how the Trump administration will affect state-level financial management and what states can do about politicized investing. Here, O.J. describes how state treasurers, auditors, and comptrollers have been working to manage state retirement funds with an eye towards returns for beneficiaries rather than promoting an ideological agenda.
Our members and financial officers have focused on this pretty judiciously and with a focus on fiduciary duty. Now, again, you've got brilliant listeners and folks who pay attention to this show, to the folks who might be new coming on, just to kind of break down some of these words. So when we say fiduciary duty, it is the expectation that you, somebody who governs, who invests, who is responsible, as you pointed out, Richard, for someone else's money, you do so focusing on, and here's another big word, a pecuniary interest or pecuniary factors. That just means that you spend your time making sure that that fund, that someone else's money, has a financial benefit to it when you invest it. And so the idea is that ESG investing, again, environmental social governance, environmental, which focuses on climate action, climate activity, interest and focus there. Social is more of the DEI, focusing on the equity piece of whatever the worldview is. And then, of course, governance, the proxy votes and the shareholder proposals attached to that. ESG investing says, instead of focusing on financial benefits, I'm going to focus on something else in tandem with financial benefits or something else entirely. So that means, again, if I care about climate change or climate action, I'm a big believer in that sort of thing. Or if I care about DEI and equity and that sort of thing, I'm going to invest in funds, in businesses that also care about that. It doesn't matter if they're successful. Doesn't matter if it would provide a financial benefit. I'm going to invest in that. And so what you've seen from court cases and what our financial officers have said is that's wrong. You need to focus on fiduciary duty, on the best possible financial returns only. Full stop. You just saw this come out of a case in a district court in Texas. There was a judge that ruled on this, the American Airlines case, that said American Airlines violated their duty to loyalty with this same idea. They didn't focus in their pension plan. Again, these are private actors. They didn't focus their pension plan explicitly on financial benefits. They used BlackRock, which by their own admission focuses on ESG investing. So our folks at the state level are fighting against this all across the country. They have said in a number of states, Texas is one of them, Kentucky is another, Oklahoma, Florida, and some others. They say, look, if you're focusing on something other than pecuniary returns, if you're focused on something other than financial benefits, we just may make the decision not to do business with you at all. They've got their lists. Those responsibilities have passed legislatures. They are now statute and law of the land, and our folks are approaching it from that perspective.
We have a lot of guests who are experts on specific policy topics, but we also have plenty of big picture thinkers with galaxy brains as well. When it comes to political theory and philosophy, we're lucky to have people like Stephanie Slade, senior editor at Reason Magazine, and our guest for episode 17. Stephanie and I discussed the history of fusionism in American politics, how it has been frequently misunderstood, and whether it can survive into the future. In episode 37, we talked with Ovik Roy, then still president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, about the Freedom Conservative Manifesto and the enduring tensions between freedom, nationalism, and populism. We also had a great talk with Sam Gregg, Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy at the American Institute for Economic Research, in episode 56 about the cultural roots of economic freedom. I was happy to be able to welcome my CEI colleague Ian Murray on for 2 episodes, 40 and 63, to discuss both the study we co-wrote on the history of the 1971 Powell Memo, and later for a meditation on the concept of the common good in political economy. Finally, we had Andre Beliveau, then at the National Taxpayers Union, on in 2023 to talk about the trouble with big government conservatism. Here, he talks about the fight over principles on the right.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think I go back and forth, but I try to be much more optimistic than I think a lot of, or at least I'm trying to be more optimistic than a lot of, I think, my colleagues sort of in the conservative movement, or those of us who are concerned about sort of, the new right, or whether that's, national conservatism or something like post-liberal Catholic integralism, these more authoritarian elements of the right, or big government conservatives, as you say. I'm a little bit more optimistic that I think I constantly see younger generations of conservatives on social media who are buying into sort of the more, for lack of a better term, the fusionist project. They're finding themselves more aligned with, sort of the National Review's principles that they just published out in their new magazine, which I would recommend to any of your viewers to read. It was in the new print edition. It's also available online of National Review's magazine. They posted their principles, effectively, what do we believe is National Review, is published by the editors. It was very good. A project that I've been a part of called the Freedom Conservatism Project. We issued a statement of principles over the summer. And I think there's a lot of overlaps between those two. And I'm seeing a lot of young conservatives falling onto that, so and referencing, Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer as sort of their intellectual heroes. That's a good sign. But of course, as you point out, and we can't ignore, there is this tension right now on the right with what sort of people are calling sort of zombie Reaganism, or the zombie fusionism, and then this new right that they, because if you're part of the old right, you don't know what time it is. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting when one says that, and these people are also usually pretty passionate about President Trump. When you look at the successes of the Trump administration, most of those came from this so-called old right. I mean, especially, some of his fiscal reforms for sure, and definitely his appointments to the Supreme Court. I mean, those are legacy positions that have been put forward by freedom conservatives and sort of the fusion coalition of Ronald Reagan style conservative, whatever you want to label us, American conservatives is what I prefer to say. Those have been policy victories, and we see when they sort of attach themselves to this more this populist trend away from those sort of first principles of limited government, free enterprise, free markets, constitutional conservatism. They tend to lose, and they have been losing. So I think a lot of this is occurring in sort of the intellectual ecosystem of the right, broadly speaking.
But what good is solid ideological grounding if those principles don't expand opportunities for people in the real world? For that, we need policies that allow for entrepreneurialism, economic opportunity, and career mobility. We started with Alfredo Ortiz, president of the Job Creators Network, who talked in episode 4 about his then new book, The Real Race Revolutionaries: How Minority Entrepreneurship Can Overcome America's Racial and Economic Divides. We had on Patrice Omuka, director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum, in episode 11. We discussed employment, education, economic growth, and the value of true diversity. In episode 66, economist Leah Palakashvili of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University talked about career development, contractors and gig work, and why working mothers especially could use more career flexibility. My former CEI colleague Josh Vandalk of the Illinois Policy Institute was here for episode 78, discussing poverty, opportunity, education, jobs, and personal empowerment. Be on the lookout, by the way, for Josh's upcoming book, How to Get What You Want: Mastering the Art of Science and Persuasion, coming in April 2026. We were also happy to welcome Rachel Barkley, director of the Able Americans Project at the National Center for Public Policy Research, for episode 107, where she covered disability accommodations, family formation, occupational therapy, caregiver responsibilities, and healthcare resources for the differently abled. Finally, we talked with the fabulous Shoshana Wiseman, then of the R Street Institute and more recently of the Abundance Institute, who gave us the 411 on all the problems with state occupational licensing. Here she is describing the absurd burdens created by these laws for people who are just trying to make a living.
So when people think of licensed occupations, I think they're thinking like electricians, plumbers, maybe doctors, lawyers, stuff like that. But people don't know that in Louisiana, you need a license to be a florist. And there's a very strong florist lobby defending it. This is the case that got me into the issue. Years ago, I heard about a woman named Sandy Meadows who basically tried to be a florist. When her husband passed away, she had never had to provide for herself, and she was learning and was good at arranging flowers, which you would think is a thing you could just like go and do and like be fine with. But not so in Louisiana. It's the only state where you need a license. So she tried to pass the exams and get through the screening, but she couldn't. It wasn't because it's really hard. The pass rate for the Louisiana florist exam was actually lower than the bar exam, which is ridiculous. So she worked illegally in a grocery. They loved her. There were no issues. There were no epidemics of harm caused by her. But when the state found out, they shut her down and said, hey, either you're firing her or we're shutting down the whole grocery. So the grocery couldn't, there was nothing they could have done about it. So when she passed away, she was in poverty because government wouldn't let her work. So there's too many stories like that. We license hair braiders, hair shampooers, manicurists, everything from that up into doctors and lawyers. And while I think we should license doctors, I think we should allow them to work across state lines. And, while I think that there's a case for licensing lawyers that I kind of go back and forth on, if you want to have some screenings, well, there's not a lot of evidence behind the process we have working at all now to make better lawyers and functional lawyers. Even with electricians, I was open to it. I thought it might have been a fine thing to license them, but there's studies that show when you license electricians, harm caused by electricity goes up because people try their hand at it at home. So even when it might make sense to license someone, you still want to make sure that the outcome is what you would want it to be and that you're not making it worse in the name of trying to make it better. And there's also other barriers. Sometimes it's registration, like the constant line I hear about contractors is you have to license them or else they'll skip out of town with people's money. You don't need a license for that. You need them to just register and say, here's me in the system. And if I skip out of town, you'll be able to find me, stuff like that. So there's all different kinds of barriers. And the way they're put into place genuinely is sometimes trying to protect the public. Other times it's lobbies. There's even a recent study showing that like when a professional association forms in a state, they increase licensing burdens or get something licensed fairly quickly. And that's not great. So lots of different sides to the issue. We even make it hard for immigrants to work here, people from other states to work across state lines, people who were formerly incarcerated to work in a profession. So there's lots of sides to the issue, but it's all pretty bleak. But it's improving, but bleak.
We love high-tech innovation here on the show as well, and we're fortunate to have many friends killing it in the world of tech policy analysis. My former colleague, Patrick Hedger, joined us for episodes 12 and 100, representing first the Taxpayers Protection Alliance and talking about antitrust and the Federal Trade Commission, and later with NetChoice, talking about safety and privacy legislation at the state level. Spencer Purnell of the Reason Foundation was here for episode 13, also talking about the future of online privacy and information sharing. Taylor Barkley, then at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University, was on for episode 26, discussing public attitudes towards big tech companies, the poor cybersecurity job the governments do, and who should be allowed to moderate our social media content. Neil Chilson, then also at the Center for Growth and Opportunity and now at the Abundance Institute, was on episode 47 to discuss emergent orders, unintended consequences, and why government policymakers need to learn some humility. You can read more from Neil, by the way, in his insightful book, Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. Adam Thierer of the R Street Institute was with us for episode 52, where we talked about AI, antitrust, permissionless innovation, and why Europe has no big tech companies. Matt Middlestead, then at the Mercatus Center, was here for episode 59, and we covered everything artificial intelligence. Episode 88 was our time to have fun with Jen Huddleston, Senior Fellow in Technology Policy at the Cato Institute. We talked about consumer privacy, government databases, identity theft, and revealed preferences. We also got a hold of Jeff Westling, then at the American Action Forum, for episode 114. He shared insights about broadcast media, the Federal Communications Commission, news distortion, the First Amendment, and the future of streaming platforms. Finally, we were very lucky to entice industry legend Gary Shapiro on the show for episode 110. Gary is the longtime CEO of the Consumer Technology Association and the man behind the number one trade show in the world, the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, held every January in Las Vegas. He joined us to talk about his recent book, Pivot or Die, How Leaders Thrive When Everything Changes. Here he is discussing why even the most innovative and productive industries end up getting scapegoated and demonized.
That's a great question. And, well, one very logical answer is our wonderful First Amendment gives anyone the opportunity to challenge things that the government is doing. And a lot of these legacy industries like the broadcasters and the motion picture industry and the music industry and some of these people I've been fighting all my life, even frankly, newspapers and magazines, they're all business models have been tossed upside down by technology in the last few decades. Like if you're a dead tree printer and you're selling advertising as media, it's difficult because you are by definition reaching a fairly broad audience where you could use social media and get your targeted audience. So life has changed. It's gotten more efficient to reach the people you want. And the broadcasters especially they're on a rampage against technology. But I think it switched, honestly. I mean, it was, I had mixed feelings about Trump's inaugural, but seeing those 5 tech leaders standing behind him, that was a turning point to me. That was a lesson. With the Biden administration, not only were they against big tech and attacking them and telling they can't buy small companies, and small companies that weren't getting funded, startups weren't getting funded because there was no exit. I mean, that's the biggest exit. A big company buys you. Not that many companies go public or even sell to private equity or just grow off their profits and can grow that way fast. You need exits with big companies, and big companies need small companies. Even at CES, they're looking to make an investment. They're looking to be the first customer. They want to learn what they're doing. They want to embrace them. And then often they want to buy part or all of them, which is all great. That's America. And all of a sudden, the Biden administration, with one person who never worked in a job in her life with a business, in her early 30s, with no management experience at all, took on this agency and became a little authoritarian figure, didn't listen to any of the other commissioners, and had all sorts of rules, barely ever came to the office herself. And it was just horrible, frankly. And thank God that period of hell is over. And we have a new FTC chairman who may not love some things about technology. The fact that, the First Amendment is pretty powerful, allows you to do all sorts of things. Section 230 is really an important element for the First Amendment in our view, because it protects not only the big technology platforms, it protects all these read review sites like Travelocity or your Nextdoor, where you learn about what's going on in your neighborhood. It's so popular. If they start being held liable, those sites just shut down. So it's the point is that we are at a turning point. I feel it's been a tough 4 years. It was an anti-business administration. And I mean, the worst thing was, I still can't fathom, they would actually, if the US laws weren't enough to stop a company, they'd go to Europe and tell them to sue American companies. I mean, we have reached the point of, jumping the shark and frankly, insanity. And it's not just one senator from Massachusetts, frankly, there's a couple that are not that friendly towards technology. And if they see it, they want to regulate it. But we don't want to be like Europe, where everything is about privacy. And we don't want to be like China, where there is no privacy at all. I think we have to be right in the middle.
In case it wasn't already clear, we're big fans of the abundance agenda here at Free the Economy. That is, creating a nation and economy where the goods and services we depend on are abundant and affordable, rather than tightly regulated, with access that's rationed by government policy. First up, fittingly enough, was our first ever guest, Institute for Progress co-founder and co-CEO, Alex Stapp. Alex joined us to discuss energy, environmental policy, housing, and how regulatory reform can help create an abundance agenda for the United States. Urban planning expert Max Dubler, now project manager at California YIMBY, was on episode 18 to talk about zoning reform, project financing, discretionary review, and impacts on homelessness. Adam Millsap of Stand Together joined us for episode 19. Talked about housing, urban renewal, migration, and competition between the states, and Adam's 2019 book, Dayton, The Rise, Decline, and Transition of an Industrial City. Alex Trembath, Deputy Director of the Breakthrough Institute, was on for episodes 15 and 142. First talking about eco-modernism and abundance in 2023, and then about energy, housing, bureaucracy, and how the abundance movement has grown in September 2025. Travis Fisher of the Cato Institute joined us for episode 49, when we talked about energy production myths, grid management, and what was really in the Inflation Reduction Act. Recent magazines, Ron Bailey was here for episode 81. We covered innovation, growth, optimism, and what Ron calls the New Progress movement. Episode 94 brought us a great conversation with Abundance Institute CEO and co-founder Chris Koopman. We covered technology, optimism, artificial intelligence, and barriers to growth. Nick Loris of C3 Solutions was here for episode 97, explaining why we're looking at a renaissance of nuclear energy in the United States. Finally, American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Jim Pethokoukis joined us for episode 43. We talked about Jim's book, The Conservative Futurist, How to Create the Sci-Fi World We Were Promised, including topics like economic growth, Star Trek, scientific innovation, and cultural attitudes towards risk. Here he is talking about the book and its themes.
The name of the book is Conservative Futurist, and that is a truth in labeling effort. I am a conservative. I work at a right-of-center think tank. But to want to create a better world through economic growth and technological progress and thinking those things are good, enhance not just prosperity, but allow us to solve problems big and small. I don't think that is, you need to be on one side of that traditional political divide. I make the point that whether you're a Democrat or Republican or however you want to describe yourself, if you think like those things are good, that, you know, we need a world of more prosperity, that people who are very poor in this world, that someday their position can be remarkably better. To me, that is looking up, that is upwing. And I did not, and of course you have the people who are just the opposite. You have the people who think, you know what, the poor can never be as rich as folks in the West. Technological change, too much risk. I mean, if we think this was a 50-year-old issue in nuclear power, clearly it isn't, because with these new advances and with AI, some people are already focusing purely on the potential for job loss or the robots all killing us. So this is a very real thing. And I call those folks downwingers. Now, I did not invent those phrases, though I have repurposed them for my own diabolical purposes in this in this book. And it's really, to me, the greatest expression of this ethos was in the film Interstellar, where Matthew McConaughey's character Cooper, who is an astronaut turned farmer because civilization is collapsing, said, you know, like, what happened to us? We used to look up in the sky and think about our place in the stars, and now we just look at the ground and think about our places in the dirt. So to me, that is a great cinematic and rare, unfortunately, distillation of this ethos.
All of these big ideas are fascinating, but sometimes you just want to kick back and enjoy yourself. That's why we made sure to include at least a few guests who are experts in recreation and fun. For episode 20, we talked with author, barista, and public policy magician Jacob Greer. We discussed tobacco control, nutrition and public health, alcohol regulation, and the unintended consequences of prohibition. You can explore Jacob's books for more great content, by the way, including The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette from 2019, and The New Prohibition, The Dangerous Politics of Tobacco Control from 2023. We sat down with Jared Dieterle, then of the Earth Street Institute, for episode 99, to talk about beer, wine, tequila, and all of the government policies affecting the price and availability of your favorite intoxicating beverages. Episode 130 was our encounter with David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. We talked about alcohol, cancer, public health, safety warnings, and risk fatigue. Finally, I had a very fun conversation with my former colleague Michelle Minton, now at the Reason Foundation, about vaping, drinking, nutrition, and the federal government's uneven record when it comes to issuing public health advice. Here she is talking about how policymakers shred their credibility when they're not honest with the public.
Yeah, and I think you're right that you know, the public confidence in public health, like in the CDC, in the FDA, has been declining for years. And I remember writing a piece just a couple months before the pandemic really broke out, where I was warning the CDC specifically because this was the summer of 2019. And there was an outbreak of a weird, mysterious lung injury that was happening first among young people and among more. Started in Michigan or one of the Midwestern states and started to bleed out of the country. And the CDC started putting out, you know, notifications and alerts about this e-cigarette related disease that was happening. And they really played it up. And all of that's great, except they weren't telling people the most important fact about all of those cases of lung illness, which was that they were almost exclusively, when the people were admitting what they used, almost exclusively associated with illicit market, cannabis products, THC vapes, that were bootlegged. And later we found out, many of us realized within a few months of that outbreak that it was vitamin E acetate, this weird solvent you can add into THC vapes. But it took the CDC many more months to start even vaguely communicating this to the public, and with the phrase of most of the cases, but not all of them, most of the cases say that they were associated with THC. And I was warning the CDC that you are going to lose the public confidence when you need it most, as in there's an outbreak of an infectious disease and you need people to take vaccines. And it was incredible that it became prophetic within a few months of that happening. And you could see immediately people pulling back from this idea of a emergency approved vaccine because people had lost confidence in the CDC throughout the earlier parts of the pandemic. All of this, and like you said, there's something good here, because I know me and a few other people have been talking about for years that there's something rotten in the field of public health, that they are not focusing on infectious diseases or really important things. They are kind of often expanding out their mandate, expanding their territory into policy issues, into political issues. Not that there isn't a role for CDC for something like, gun deaths, but should the CDC be the one dictating policy on this?
And of course, no one is more interested in the podcast industrial complex than people with their own shows. People who host on a regular basis can also make great guests. Hint, hint. We had a great time welcoming economist and Let People Prosper host Vance Ginn in for episodes 21 and 141, where we discussed first, competition between states for people and capital, the debt ceiling negotiations and confusion over unemployment numbers, and then Vance's new book, Empower Patients, Two Doctors' Cure for Healthcare. Peter Lipset of Donors Trust and the Giving Ventures podcast was with us for episodes 74 and 138. First on charitable giving, tax deductions, and donor privacy, and then to discuss his fascinating podcast series on ideological diversity on the right. Reason Magazine reporter Eric Boehm weighed in for episode 90 to talk about his limited run podcast series, Why We Can't Have Nice Things, about the frustrating and foolish policies that drive up prices and limit the availability of vital goods and services. My CEI colleague, dispatch columnist, and host of How the World Works, Kevin Williamson, came on for episode 139 to talk about everything from food waste in restaurants to tariffs, wealth disparities, economic development, marginal costs and benefits, and the perpetual delusion that government can solve all of our problems for us. Finally, the entertaining and insightful Corbin Bartold of Tech Freedom and the Tech Policy Podcast joined us for episodes 72 and 131. First on how consumer tech impacts political alliances, how people build virtual communities, and why the pessimists are usually wrong. Then we team back up to do a deep dive on the AI-powered future, including LLMs, doomers, deepfakes, epistemic bubbles, and how to make art in the 21st century. Here he is talking about state-level laws on artificial intelligence applications and how they could kill AI progress.
You are correct that you can do a lot of damage with bad policy. I think we may need to save for another time a post-mortem on the AI moratorium. We recently saw die in Congress an effort to get some federal preemption of state laws. I think we're now going to get a lot of crazy state laws. I think a lot of those are going to try to control the outputs of AI in the way I described. The PMC strikes back. I think I am worried that state laws could kill AI progress in the way I mentioned at the outset of making sure it doesn't actually cause real change in the real world. AI can be super smart. It's still going to have to get around NEPA. It's still going to have to get around HIPAA. I had Sayash Kapoor on the show late last year, and he made the point that intelligence and power are not the same thing. And you can have something that's very smart that nevertheless is thwarted because it doesn't have power in the real world. And I think that's very, very real. I would push back a little bit on the cultural angle. And my attitude is a little more that we have a wave that is coming that short of a complete discarding of our First Amendment tradition or some kind of Butlerian jihad, the ideas that AI is going to spawn, that's a genie that's not going back in the bottle. The internet is a very difficult thing to put clamps on. There are VPNs in the world. There are places in the world that can create AI models, even if we kick everyone out of San Francisco. So even if the plaintiff's lawyers succeed in shutting down Complexity AI, that's another one that we may need to save for another episode to talk more largely about the lawsuits that are being brought, saying, wow, kids are talking to these AI agents. We can't have that. I think that's a pretty futile fight. And I do think that culturally we need to start grappling with what is going to happen when people go into their little AI worlds and are able to do sort of what we had a moral panic about a few years ago about rabbit holes. It was completely overblown with YouTube and social media. It wasn't nothing, but it was overblown. And my intellectual humility, I guess I should say, that while I've always looked at with great skepticism about these things, and it's a very elite narrative, the rubes, the peasants, their minds are being controlled by the things they're being, exposed to, the hypodermic needle theory of ideas. I'm very allergic to that. But I have to admit that as I look at how powerful some of this new AI is, I need to come in with fresh eyes when thinking about, okay, is this just the next step in books and video games and movies? Like, we freak out every time, the kids are playing video games, it's going to destroy their brains, and this is just the same thing, and it's going to be another moral panic. Is that it? Or is there really a possibility that now people will be able to live in their little AI world? You want to live in your medieval times AI with your AI agents that you form real friendships with in a totally different world from baseline reality, or whatever, your utopian world or your cyberpunk world. And enough of that, it adds up. And in effect, what you've basically done on a very personal level is what the Amish do in our society. And no, people really are profoundly changed by the technology in ways that are very, very unpredictable.
So that came around full circle in a way I was not expecting. The Amish are the true AI nerds, in a weird way. So that's the big 150th extravaganza. Special thanks to everyone involved who has been a guest on the show, who has helped promote it, and who has been involved with its production. Extra special thanks to the communications team here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, especially my co-editor and co-producer, Destry Edwards, who takes what I produce each week and turns it into a real show. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week for episode 151.